Thank you, Ken, for joining us. Just by way of quick intro, if you're not familiar with BP3, we are all about helping our clients find a faster way to get to their business outcomes. RPA is a key technique in the automation journey, right, to really accelerate time to value, right, to get to the value that you want faster than we ever could before, really. And Automation Anywhere has been a great partner for us in delivering value for our clients. And I'm really excited to have Ken join us today. Ken is the global industry leader for financial services at Automation Anywhere, and I will let Ken do a more robust introduction and kind of walk you through some great content that I think will get the conversation started. And welcome your questions, by the way, just real quick, welcome your questions. If you put them in, we'll, kind of tee those up for Ken so he can focus on content, and we'll just kind of barrage him with questions.
Look forward to that. All right, well, welcome everyone. As Scott mentioned, I'm Ken Mertzel. I'm the global industry leader for financial services at Automation Anywhere. And I'm happy to speak with you since I spent most of my career in finance. Prior to joining Automation Anywhere 5 years ago, I was at Bank of America for 15 years, half of that as CFO of their insurance group, and then most recently worked for the chief accounting officer, managing financial operations, and also helped them implement the first proof of concept of RPA in finance. So I can relate to the journey that many of you are going through. So with that, let me first just tell you a little bit about Automation Anywhere for just a second, and then I'll run through the agenda here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Okay. So most of you may already be familiar with Automation Anywhere, since it looks like most of you have a fair amount of familiarity with RPA space. But just for those of you who are new, we're one of the global leaders in RPA. You can see we've had digital workers deployed across the globe. Over 2.8 million digital workers deployed. So you can argue we're one of the largest virtual employers, if you will. And then, I mentioned we're one of the top players in the market, but I know when I was in industry, I was always skeptical because all the vendors said they were number one. So you could just take a look at a lot of the third-party research that's out there by some of the analysts that are listed here to get more info in the industry. So that's it about us. So in terms of the agenda for today, I wanted to go through really two specific things. One is just want to talk about some of the trends we're seeing in automation and in RPA specifically, and then spend a majority of the time talking about specific use case examples in finance. And as Scott mentioned, do go into the Q&A function and put any questions that come up. And, Scott will raise those and we'll make sure to answer all of them at the end. So with that, just from a broad trend standpoint, I think it's interesting because we've seen very broad, trends around what's been happening around automation, particularly in the finance space. And really, this is true across all organizations. And I think if you go back to the 90s, all of you can remember, business process reengineering, that was all the rage. Very much focused on, how do you go ahead and change and make your processes more efficient from a organizational standpoint. And then in the 2000s, offshoring became very popular, which is really sort of just primarily cost arbitrage by moving to some of the basic manual repetitive work to lower cost operations and lower cost regions. And then from there, we've seen over the past decade a huge amount of focus around migrating to enterprise platforms, as well as even more recently, really the migration to cloud. And that's been a pretty big transformation effort that frankly still continuing to go on, but really trying to ensure that all of your basic platform as well as your data structures drive the efficiency within your operations. And then what we're seeing today, and really the focus of today's discussion, is really around intelligent automation. So I think there's been a shift from focusing on how can you improve your processes to really how can you make your employee base not only more productive, but really be able to leverage their talent. So they're focused more on where they have expertise and less time in very manual repetitive tasks. And so that's really what RPA is all about, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So if you look at some of the factors that have been driving transformation in finance, and it's been going on for quite a long time, certainly well before the pandemic. But I think one of the major factors that we've seen particularly recently is around just macroeconomic pressure, right? Any time where the enterprise is facing significant pressure, whether it's pandemic or recessions, that's where finance is really taking the lead in terms of how can they support the business and drive business continuity and ensure continued growth in top and bottom line. In addition, finance has always been very focused on capital and liquidity, and again, organizations have seen a lot of pressure in recent times in that front. Another key factor really for finance is expense management. And it's not just driving down expenses within the finance function itself, but as stewards for the entire organization. And so we continue to see sort of elevated interest in how can finance drive expense efficiency and increase productivity, and frankly, also increase cash flow across the organization. Another major factor driving transformation is risk and compliance. Given all the accounting standards and regulatory standards that companies face, they need to ensure that they're 100% compliant associated with those, and looking at how they can leverage technology to do so. And then lastly, finance is constantly looking for how can they ensure timely as well as accurate reporting. And organizations are very focused around strengthening governance and control. So again, we'll talk today about how technology can enable that. And I think the reason why technology is so important, particularly in finance and accounting, is the fact that, I mentioned that they're facing the demanding accounting standards and regulatory standards. But on top of that, it's challenging because, I've never been in an organization where you have, 100% accurate data or even consistent data when you look across different sources. And finance needs to ensure that they're leveraging sort of the single source of truth and ensuring accurate information in all their financial data. In addition, the challenge continues to be that there are, wide variety of legacy systems across an organization that don't talk to one another. And so, again, often people are used as sort of that glue between systems that aren't connected. In addition, finance is challenged because I've never seen a finance organization where I say, hey, we have unlimited budget and unlimited resources. And usually when there is more budget, it goes to, top line revenue generating areas. And so therefore, finance is always in the situation where they're trying to do, more with less and try to, leverage their resources as best they can to support the businesses. And then lastly, unfortunate organizations, the number one workflow tool, if you will, is really spreadsheets. It's Excel. And so therefore, in finance and across the organization, most of, the reports and a lot of the processes are managed via Excel. So that again makes it challenging when trying to drive efficiency within finance and across the organization. So what we'll do today is talk about how RPA can address those challenges and how finance in particular is doing that. So it looked like from the poll, most of you are pretty familiar with RPA, so I won't go into detail about what it is, but there might be one or two of you who are new to it. And I know when I started looking at RPA when I was in industry, one of the biggest challenges I had is just exactly what can it do and what is it, particularly because it's called robotic, and so people think actual bots. But as most of you know, it's simply software that sits on top of any existing systems and is used to perform very manual, repetitive, data-based activities. They need to be driven by a series of rules that you put into the bots. So if you have a lot of judgment that's involved, you might run a process with a bot, then have human intervention, then continue, or add additional cognitive capabilities. So and the other difference I think is that unlike traditional automation, typically integrates seamlessly with any applications, very quick to implement, as opposed to traditional automation that might take months, is typically weeks to automate a process, and very low cost as well. So a typical example I might give is let's just say you're processing invoices or in any system, kind of doing some daily processing work, you'll typically, log into your system with your employee ID, download some data, maybe create a report in Excel, upload that information back into the system, and send an email to your supervisor letting them know you're done. The RPA bots do exactly the same thing at the click step level. In fact, you'll often employ recorders to see exactly what you're doing from a click step standpoint. Bots will often be assigned a employee ID, for example, to log into systems, and will do exactly the same things that an employee would do based on a series of rules that are programmed in. So again, RPA can do any of these kind of routine, repetitive tasks. It can actually open emails and attachments, take information out of PDFs and populate that into your automation process. It can, copy information from one source and maybe paste that into your ERP system, fill out forms, etc. So any of those manual repetitive tasks, a bot can do that. So I think one of the key trends that we're seeing is really it's the integration of capabilities, including RPA, that really create a digital workforce. In other words, the ability to truly enable and provide, essentially a digital assistant to employees. And so, built within our platform, we have all these capabilities. And I mentioned them just more as an example of the type of capabilities that you'll want when you're enabling your teams. So one of the first things that organizations look at is, well, what processes should I automate? Or maybe I have a couple different people performing the processes slightly different, and I want to figure out exactly which process I want to automate before I go ahead and start creating the bots. And so within our platform is something called Discovery Bot. Again, it'll leverage those recorders. It'll see exactly how individuals are performing their task. It'll help you decide which process to automate. And then once you've done that, because those recorders were there, it actually has already created the code for the bots themselves. And then from there, you can make them more robust and add exception processing, et cetera. In addition, another typical challenge for automation is you might have a lot of documents that are sitting in unstructured or semi-structured form. So I mentioned before the example of a PDF file, right? So you can't really automate that data until you've been able to digitize that. So, by way of example, we built an IQ-bot into our platform that'll automatically take all the information from those PDF files, structure that data into Excel or into a database, and then you're able to put that through the automation. I think the difference versus traditional OCR, which has been around forever, is the fact that it's leveraging much more advanced technologies nowadays, such as computer vision and machine learning, to give you much higher throughput rate in terms of accurately extracting that information. And then next, obviously, key to the platform is RPA itself. Traditional automation has been more unattended, where you kick off a bot, it does its thing behind the scenes, then you pick up where it left off. Nowadays, we'll show you examples of attended automation where you basically have a real-time digital assistant. So you're interacting with that bot in real time as you do your work. And the last key element is around smart analytics. So for example, in our platform, you have real-time dashboards called Bot Insights. So you can get insights not only how the bots are performing, but given all the data flowing through, you can get really interesting insights on actually how your business and operations are performing. So that's about it about the technology. I did want to mention that, I talked about sort of the concept of a digital assistant. And so built into the platform, in our platform, is something called RA, or Automation Anywhere Robotic Interface. And the importance of this is, again, if you think about the typical situation where most of your employees are dealing with a wide variety of systems, they're dealing with, productivity systems, whether that's, Workday or Microsoft Office or what have you. And then on top of that, they're dealing with all the various systems that handle core operations, whether that's, order management, inventory management, billing, you name it, right? And all the typical names you would see here, SAP, Oracle, et cetera. And then on top of that, then they're trying to perform all the, typical tasks they might be, and they're having to, be able to know how to log in and work with all these individual systems. And the benefit of something like this robotic interface is, really the employee just deals with that bot interface. So you can create customized forms, if you will, for any particular activity you're doing. So they're just working on that interface as opposed to working directly in all these different systems. And again, it just makes it easier to perform typical activities. So that's really it about where the technology is going. What I want to spend most of the time on now is really talking about specifically why, and more importantly, how it's being used within finance. So it's interesting actually because finance is actually the largest, corporate function user across all organizations, and it might not be surprising to most of you who are familiar with finance because finance typically tries to lead by example. They'll leverage the technology to streamline their own operations, but then ultimately are sort of pushing that across the organization to really drive efficiency across the entire organization. And efficiency usually is why organizations initially start with RPA, but typically, organizations find significant additional benefits, and I think that's why it's taken off in finance too. So I mentioned before about the ability to enhance timeliness and really accelerate the close by leveraging the technology. Another key benefit is around strengthening governance. And I've met with finance organizations say, yeah, absolutely, I want to drive productivity and efficiency. But, for me, just as important, if not more important, is really tightening controls to ensure I can continue to improve accuracy. And the RPA platform enables you to do that. It has a centralized control room. You basically can see exactly what bots are running when. So it provides you a complete audit log and audit trail, which is important for internal and external audit as well as regulators. So again, you have much more control over what's being performed and what's being automated, as opposed to for example, often individuals have built macros in Excel that were hard-coded, years ago, and the employees are no longer there. So you have much less transparency and visibility versus using a bot. And then in addition, organizations are really using. Oh yeah, is there a question?
I can interrupt real quick, Ken. On the governance point of view for finance, it seems to me like sometimes the regulations or the compliance governance rules that get put into effect can unintentionally incur a massive amount of work. And is RPA really, reducing that friction or allowing you to comply with governance requests that previously just would have been kind of untenable to comply with?
Yeah, I think it helps in a couple of different ways. One is, it really standardizes the compliance. So in other words, in terms of your traditional manual processes, you're only as compliant as you are with the individuals who are following the specific rules and procedures. A bot doesn't have that option, right? As long as you code in the rules for the bot exactly, in a compliant fashion, the bot's going to consistently perform that way. In addition, often, as you mentioned, when changes occur, it's a major effort, not only in terms of changing the processes, but in terms of working with the various technology, working with IT, get those coded in, and often can take quite an amount of time to do so. Given the ease of use of bots, it's more or less drag and drop. You can automate a change fairly quickly relative to how you can with traditional automation. Obviously, you'd have the appropriate governance and controls over doing so, but I think it enables you to, implement the changes more consistently and also, quicker. So, the other thing about how organizations are using RPA is really to sort of drive their innovation efforts. RPA is a great way to get started because, again, unlike some AI technologies, it's very mature. It's been around for quite a long time. So it's not like unproven technology or black box technology. You can see exactly what bots are doing when. And so organizations often start with RPA and they add additional, cognitive AI capabilities. And then lastly, and I think, frankly, this is most important, particularly in finances. I think there were a lot of concern years ago about, are RPA bots going to replace people? And what we've seen how individuals or organizations are using bots is really to enhance individuals' capabilities and really help them focus on much more value-added activities. So rather than collecting data, creating reports, they're focused much more on analysis, which is really where you want your limited resources focused. So next, shifting to the remainder of the time I'll spend is really on use cases, which is probably where most of you are interested. And so I often use this slide. This is not intended to show every single use case in RPA and finance, but some of the more common areas where we're typically seeing automation. And so what I'll do is I'll briefly go through these, and I'm going to show you some actual examples in more detail, and I'll show you a very brief demo of one example. So starting on the left, I'd say procure to pay and accounts payable is probably the most common use case. And I think the reason for that, for those of you that are familiar with the process, is it's extremely data intensive, manual process oriented, document intensive, all the criteria that you would use typically to identify RPA opportunities. And so specifically within AP, we see it used pretty frequently for, setting up new vendors, and probably most commonly to, validate invoices and ultimately drive payment. And I'm going to show you a detailed example of that shortly. For similar reasons, order to cash and accounts receivable is probably a close second in terms of usage. Again, used to set up new customers, process sales orders, create invoices, etc. And then a lot of interest, of course, in the core record to report functions in terms of operations and accounting. I think starting in financial operations, probably the most common areas are around automating manual reconciliations. Certainly, I would recommend anything you can put into your automated reconciliation system. You should absolutely do that first. But to the extent you have more complex manual reconciliations, that's where you can utilize bots to automate those. Similar with manual journal entries, trial balances, master data management, etc. A fair amount of interest in treasury operations. Particularly, we've seen a lot of use cases around consolidating information across your various banks, whether those statements are, again, PDF or electronic, and then creating a consolidated cash position reporting. And then in tax, it's not so much doing the tax accounting, but typically we see it utilized to source the data for tax or actually, complete tax filings. And then lastly, FP&A or financial planning analysis. We do get a lot of interest in this area just because, again, it's highly manual. Almost every report I've ever seen is typically done in Excel. So there's certainly opportunities to automate reports, for example, or to help automate budgeting and forecasting. But I typically recommend organizations to start more on the left to get some of those high volume use cases where you're likely to get a higher ROI. And then as you get more familiar with the technology and maybe move towards more citizen development where some individuals can develop the bots in the organization, the costs come down and therefore you can leverage it more for doing management reporting in conjunction with other tools like Tableau, etc. So that's a high level overview. As I mentioned, what I want to do today is go into some specific examples. So I'm going to cover these four in particular. I'll show you examples in AP, Treasury, AR, and financial operations, just to give you a feel for how the technology is utilized. And again, these are like pretty, commonly like the top four use cases we see. So accounts payable, I mentioned why it's particularly valuable to apply the technology. This is a flow to just give you a sense for how it works. And I'm actually going to show you just a 1-minute demo so you can see it in action in terms of what it does. So what you'll see in the demo is this typical use case where, let's say you have an email inbox where you typically receive invoices. And so what will happen typically is a bot can be triggered. So as soon as any email comes in the inbox, the bot will look at that email. It'll notice that there's a PDF. It can actually open up that PDF file and then extract the information from that the PDF using technologies like I mentioned, that IQ bot. Once it takes all that information, it'll then put it into, like, for example, a Excel CSV file, and then typically is uploaded into your ERP system. And again, it could be any ERP, show SAP here, but it could be Oracle, etc. And then once it goes into the ERP, all those invoice details will be loaded into the ERP, then either via the ERP or via specific rules you set up. It'll go ahead and match invoice against purchase orders or goods receipts to validate it, and then based on a series of rules, can go ahead and approve the invoice for payment. Obviously, there are exception queues set up, so to the extent for whatever reason an invoice isn't readable, or there wasn't a match with the purchase order, that's when, again, you want individuals involved. So they're really focusing on that, 5, 10, 15% of exceptions as opposed to 100% manual processing. So with that, let me go ahead and show you, again, it's only 1-minute demo. I'll kind of talk you through it here, but the process I just described is exactly what you'll see in this example. So here you're actually seeing that the platform, first step, as I mentioned, is looking at emails. So you can see the bot will actually scan through your email inbox or the inbox that's been set up for invoices. It'll see, okay, I do have one with a PDF file. It'll download that PDF and actually extract that PDF file. And so once it's extract the PDF, then it'll go ahead and use the technology I described to read all the fields within that invoice. It's very easy to train to do so. And you can see how it's now populating an Excel file with all that data. So now you have a structured format to then populate into your ERP systems. The next step, and you can see this is the actual flow that you would see in the platform, right? And you can see it's literally as easy as drag and drop, log into SAP. So here again, the bot would get a user login. It's logged into SAP. It'll then take that Excel that it's created and actually populate all the information into, again, SAP, Workday, Oracle, what have you. Once it's done that, then you could have it programmed to say, hey, to your supervisor, hey, I've completed this task. Again, you typically wouldn't do it for every single invoice, but just showing the example that to the extent you need to, you can code the bots to actually send out invoices either for approval or for just acknowledgement that the task is complete. So very simplified example, but again, you can kind of see the basic capabilities as well as, again, just the basics of the platform itself. So you can kind of see that on the left side, they were just drag and drop commands. So when you're going to code it, again, you don't really need to be a programmer. You can, say open SAP or open Excel or what have you. So pretty easy to use, which is important when you're looking to scale the technology. So probably obvious to most of you in this example why RPA might be beneficial. I mean, certainly it drives down the cost per invoice. But again, in automating those steps, it's now eliminating invoice processing errors, which is really critical because if you do have errors, basically you're going to end up with unhappy vendors and suppliers, which will result in either challenges in supply, which no one wants nowadays because there are already plenty of challenges there, or you'll start getting late payment fees. And then probably most important is, again, it frees up the capacity. So if you're a growing organization with a growing number of invoices, you don't want to be staffing up your AP team proportionally, and so it really enables you to scale better and really focus your AP professionals on those much more complex invoices that you want them to research. So again, very common example, and whether or not you're doing AP, just think about those capabilities and how you might apply them to any process in finance. A second process I want to talk about is around, again, sort of daily cash balance reconciliations and treasury. This is a typical example and a typical process you might go through, right? So, and nearly all these tasks can be automated with a bot. So again, the bot could be set up to go out and extract all of your bank statements from all of your accounts. And again, those could be electronic statements, that could be PDF forms, what have you, but it'll extract all that information either directly from PDFs or from bank websites, what have you. It can then go out and extract all the cash transactions from the general ledger as well. And then you can leverage the bots to compare those transactions, identify any non-matching items, maybe make adjustments like, for example, deposits in transit or any outstanding checks. And then you could program the bots to make adjustments or propose adjusting entries to the extent that it sees any issues out there. You may have likely an analyst maybe look at those proposed adjustments before they're booked just to make sure that they're accurate. And then you can run the bots to do, basically another balance just to ensure that now, in fact, everything is in balance. So that's a very common example. And I mentioned, any type of reconciliation really lends itself well towards the technology. A third example I mentioned was around billing. And again, this is a very common area. Very critical, as you can imagine, in terms of getting invoices right, so you don't have upset customers or you don't have lost revenue. And on top of that, really drives increased cash flow. So even though organizations focus on driving down expenses, equally, if not more important, to drive down your day sales outstanding. And so this is a typical example from one of our clients, Juniper Networks. But what they had done is they looked and found for their top 5 customers, which drove a high percentage of their business, it was an entirely manual billing process. And so, the bills were processed only, when their employees were there, sort of 5 days a week between, 9 and 5. And so created issues in terms of timeliness, issues in terms of errors, and issues from a cash flow standpoint. And so what they did is actually created sort of a customer billing portal and actually automated the billing process for those customers. So it would, the bots would access the orders from the purchase order system. It would input all the details into the invoicing portal. It would validate the accuracy of the invoice, matching against, for example, the purchase order to ensure that all the specific items in terms of quantities and prices are accurate. And then it would review and send that bill out to the customer. And so, the large benefit of doing so is A, you got accuracy, but B, now it's a 24/7 process. So as opposed to having to wait if it happens, a purchase order comes through on a weekend, you can immediately bill 24/7. And on top of that, most importantly, all the bills are therefore accurate. So they saw significant benefits, 2 days improved cash flow, 33% reduction in terms of the manual effort, and 100% accuracy. The last example I'll share with you is around manual reconciliations. And again, bots can be used to perform any type of reconciliation. Typically, what you might do is maybe try to consolidate the types of reconciliation, because obviously all reconciliations aren't made equal. You're not going to get a lot of return on investment if you create a bot for one reconciliation. And so typically, what I've seen, what I've done in my past is standardize some of those. So you get big blocks of reconciliations, or maybe you already have some centralized shared services organization that's performing some of the manual reconciliations. Basically, what you can do then is leverage bots to perform those. So the bots can extract transactions from the general ledger. Then it can extract those transactions from the sub ledgers as well, and then perform a match to ensure that those reconcile. To the extent there is anything out of balance, they can actually again, the bots can prepare an adjusting entry, and then you can have your accountant take a look, maybe research those, validate the adjusting entry, and then go ahead and have the bot post those into your GL. So again, that's a very common example on any type of matching function, if you will, or preparing the trial balances, loading those up into your ERP system. Those would be very common examples of usage of RPA. So the last thing I'll share with you is that, of course, RPA is not leveraged only within finance. I mean, again, it can be used anywhere across an organization where you have manual processing. We see, nowadays almost equal interest in HR. You can imagine, for example, all the work associated with recruiting talent in terms of, getting all the resumes screened, getting employees, tracking the recruiting status, creating offer letters, very common use case. And then in addition, once an employee is on board, probably the most interesting use case is around, getting employees set up and on board. You think about when you joined the company and getting your laptop set up and your employee ID set up and all that set up. I mean, now organizations are using bots to do all that setup. In addition, there's a lot of interest in IT, in a variety of different tasks, but particularly in terms of supporting the help desk, handling tickets, et cetera, very common. And then sourcing and procurement, also another very common area, looking at managing purchase orders, helping with procurement planning. And these are a lot of the corporate functions. Beyond that, obviously, in the core operations itself, whether that's in banking and in lending operations, or in manufacturing in terms of core operations, helping with logistics, for example, very used very commonly across organizations. But I'd say it is common that things start off in finance. They mention the benefits of it to others in the organization, and it really takes off from there. So those were the highlights I wanted to share with you today. I'll turn it back to Scott, and we can answer any questions you might have.
Hey, awesome, Ken. Hey, we had a good one coming from Lisa about where and how you're seeing companies use citizen developers. I'm sure her company might not be alone in that. Oftentimes, IT views RPA is still very technical or not very supportive of the concept of citizen development, and we've certainly seen that with some of our clients. How have you seen that work, or how do you get over those kinds of objections, or should you? Right, I guess is maybe.
No, it's a great question, and typically organizations that have scaled. I mean, we have organizations not just in finance but across an entire company where they're running hundreds, if not thousands, of bots. And typically, how they get to that scale is not hiring a team of 100 people in the COE. or thousands of consultants to code them. What they're doing is ultimately to get to that kind of scale. Typically, they will have a citizen development program, but obviously there are a lot of concerns associated with that because, particularly from an IT or risk management standpoint, like, hey, how do I know the bots are going to be developed in the appropriate way? They're going to have the appropriate, risk controls associated with them and quality. And so I'd say the way that programs are typically rolled out is there's certainly an important governance element, right? And so I think you want to draw that appropriate balance, because if you put like too much governance, just like you might over traditional automation, you're not going to receive a return, nor are you going to see the speed that you would see with, that you would typically be looking for traditional automation. But that being said, if you have no governance, right, you're going to run into all kinds of other issues or end up with shadow IT. And so I would kind of think about it as sort of like, Excel macros in the sense that, you don't have, tight governance over those, but at the same time, like I come from the banking industry, you will have model risk management. So to the extent those Excel spreadsheets are true, like high risk models, you do want some kind of governance and oversight. So typically what organizations will do is they don't really push out citizen development like every single employee is coding bots, right? They'll typically say, hey, in parts of the organization where you have a lot of use cases and maybe some folks who are a bit more technical, you don't have to be a programmer, but you're kind of familiar with the concept, have sort of that logical sort of tech savvy mind, then they'll identify a few people within like the finance organization or any part of the organization to do some of that citizen development training and provide, we have a lot of online training as well as in-person training. So you'll train them up. So again, first, it's just it's a core, groups of people in different areas as opposed to everyone doing anything. And then on top of that, even if you have a citizen developer, you'll typically have some type of QA oversight. So it might be the COE or IT who does like a quick QA review just before the bots are put in production. On top of that, usually your COE, or again, maybe it's a group within each of the businesses, will have oversight about how those bots go into production. So you'll typically have within your centralized control room, a development, testing, and production environment, just like you would in traditional automation. And so, typically the developer can't just throw those into production without some type of review and someone centrally turning them on. So again, you have a good balance of controls, but not so much control that it's going to take you, forever to get those rolled out. I would say also that typical organizations might start with a more centralized model. So initially, you'll have your COE develop them or a third party develop them, and then over time, you might allow certain groups to develop them. So usually organizations don't start day one with citizen development, but I think the goal is a lot of organizations, move towards that over time as you want to scale.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was talking to a client the other day who their view is sort of for attended bots, they don't worry nearly as much about governance as they do. They treat that more like a macro, right? It's something you're in control over. It's running on your laptop, right? You're there to play catch if there's a mistake. Whereas things that are going to run unattended, they treat more like IT software and goes through a normal sort of IT governance at some level. And I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective or divide that they took.
Yeah, I think in general, I just recommend having control and governance over any types of bots. Obviously attended and unattended are very different. Typically in attended mode, like if I step outside of finance for a second, although again there are finance examples, but like in the customer service world, right, where you might have hundreds of bots for all of your CSRs. They're typically just interfacing with a customized screen. So they're not really direct. As far as they can tell, they're not really, doing a lot of bot related items. And so it's the people behind, and so obviously you don't have all the CSRs coding bots, right? So they're just leveraging the customized forms. Certainly behind the scenes, the individuals who have created those and being, and they're being used by hundreds, they have very strong controls before those are rolled out. Right. And I do recommend that organizations, because people say, oh, well, what kind of controls do you need to maintain to extent, let's say, upstream or downstream, your data or your systems change, right? What happens then? Well, my answer is, what do you do in the current manual environment? Because even though you've automated, you still need to maintain all those controls, right? Because things change. And so you need, as the person who's running the bot, if you will, or the department that's running it, you still need to maintain those controls and ownership over the bots just as you would over manual processes, and ensure that you're coordinating with IT and what have you, so that when things do change, you have those governance and controls in place just like you would in the manual environment.
No, I think those are really good points, Ken. Another comment I'll make, circling back to, your first example where you showed IQBot kind of, reading an inbound invoice and putting that into the flow. I think as somebody who's been in the process space for a long time, right? For 20 years or so, doing process improvement and process automation, that was always an area, 15 years ago, you sort of had to draw the line at wherever the doc came in, and you had to pick up the thread after someone had read the document, typed it into SAP or whatever the system was. And then from there on, you could worry about how to optimize the process. And I think one of the sort of revolutions that intelligent document processing and IQBot have really brought to the table is that you can go upstream now to the point where the document arrives, whether it's electronic or physical, and read those documents in. And the quality of the information that we can read out of structured and unstructured documents has really improved. So I think if you're looking at processes like that, you should definitely reach out to us, because I think that's something that we've had great success with over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I agree. And you can see, you can think of so many use cases that have to start with some kind of document that's not digitized, right? And so, particularly in finance, or if you're in audit, right, working with work papers, what have you. So you're right that you can automate that much more of the process. But I think on top of that, the technology's advanced so much, right? So before you get up, you'd still have maybe whatever, a 30 or 40% kickout rate. And so now, leveraging all that technology, you're able to get a much higher throughput rate. And then lastly, the difference is now that it's so much more user-friendly, right? You used to have to hire whatever OCR experts or data experts. And now, just like RPA, that training the IQBot, I didn't show it today, but it's literally drag and drop, like in terms of, you drag in the IQBot icon in terms of your automation flow. And then on top of that, in terms of training it, you run 100 documents through it. It'll literally show you for each document, okay, this is the field that I'm using for invoice number. This is the field I've used for amount. And you can say, oh, no, that isn't right. And you would literally drag that little square to a different field on that PDF that you'd see on your screen. Right. And by doing so, then it learns over time. So it's much more easier to use. And the last thing, and what we found the key for us is the fact that now it's integrated into our platform, right? So before you'd say, yeah, I absolutely need that. I want that technology, but I have to go to now another vendor and then figure out how to integrate with my RPA platform. And so that's why we've built it into the platform itself. So it's not like a separate thing you have to do. It's just built into the platform. And if you have, it doesn't really matter. We have proprietary technology built in, but if you're using, your own OCR, and again, I'm not a technologist, but your OCR technologies, whether it's Abby or Google, what have you, that's already been pre-built into the platform. You can use whatever extraction technology you use today and just throw it into your automation.
Yeah. And we've had some great success with IQBot and our clients. So I can confirm what you're saying, Ken. It's worked out great.
Yeah. The other nice thing I say, because again, I was on the other side, so I'm always skeptical a little bit of technology to make sure it really works, is, with IQBot, it's really easy to see if it works, or run 100 document throughs, see what the throughput rate is, right? And so rather than, worrying like I'm going to invest 6 months and hundreds of $1,000s and then finds out something doesn't work, you can very quickly test and see if it's applicable.
Yep, no, that's right. It's really kind of easy to test and verify and get comfortable with it, which is kind of amazing. We got another question on the citizen development front, from Lisa, which is, has BP3 ever helped clients establish the governance and the training structure to help establish that citizen developer program? And we have. In fact, we did an acquisition earlier this year of Agilify, which was part of Ascension Health, before that, and ran their massive RPA program there. And a big component of their approach is teaching people how to help themselves, right? The citizen developer approach. And so that was really one of the reasons why we were so interested in bringing them into BP3. So the answer is yes, we'd love to work with you on that. I think there's really some great thought leadership about how to set up that governance and how to create the right sort of incentives, positive, incentives for people to participate and get them excited about it.
Yeah, and that's really critical.
That's a great material as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think that's going to be very, would be very helpful to companies, because, I'd say one of the top success factors beyond, technology and what have you is, again, having the right governance and organizational model. And typically we do see organizations have some type of, center of excellence. But again, you don't want to staff up hundreds of people there. And so typically it's a very light touch COE that, again, will help provide, change management, program management, education and training, some of the ground rules of process selection. But then more of a federated model so that you'll have points of contact within each of the business lines that are looking at technology, because they're much more familiar with the operations. They can help identify where the opportunities are. They can even help do the initial process design. And again, in a selective citizen development model, they might even have a few, people who can develop them in the organization, or you leverage the, the COE to do that. So I'd say in all organizations where they've successfully scaled, a real key to success is having that COE. And COEs, if they're set up right, really help accelerate the development. If they're not, it can be sort of a barrier to development, in terms of the overloading, in terms of, governance and traditional roles, what have you. So I think getting help in terms of how to set that up very early on, drives success.
Well, I think one of the keys is to set up the principles, and one of the key principles is that for a COE is to act as grease, not friction, right? Your idea is to help people, not to create barriers to entry, and that is it's a fine line, right? You want people to do things right, but you also want to help them, and so you have to kind of set the values the right way so that they feel like their job is to help the rest of the company be more effective.
Yeah, it is a different mindset because again, if you come out of the traditional, IT governance, which is, there for obviously the right reasons, you still want governance, but it can be a lighter, again, I keep coming back to the Excel macro example. Again, this has a lot more capabilities, but think about, you do want some governance so people aren't doing anything for, core processes, but what's the right level? And so it's finding that balance to sort of drive scale, but at the same time, not completely lose control.
Yeah. And, that kind of, your answer that kind of leads me back to, what, besides having that COE, what are the other success factors that, really lead to a good, successful implementation of RPA at scale?
Well, certainly having the best platform, which is clearly ours, but no, having obviously the right tools is key. But once you get the tools, I think another real key is process selection, right? Because RPA is great and it does a lot of the manual repetitive process I described, but it obviously doesn't work for every single process. So I think the key is to develop help people understand what the technology does, what it doesn't do, and then just come up with a big list. And then go through a formalized, their very typical criteria you might use to identify what processes would lend themselves for that, build like a small business case associated with them, and then go forward. I think some organizations get caught up in, I'm going to pick the absolute most complex process I can possibly find, on day one, and then, RPA doesn't work. Now, RPA can handle very complex processes, but again, I would start, smaller, find some high scale, simpler cases, and then add complexity over time. But there's some things, if it involves a ton of judgment, you're going to need to leverage additional technologies or have, breaks in the process, because again, more common automations are automating portions of processes, not entire end-to-end. So process selection is absolute key. And another one, probably obvious to most folks is executive sponsorship. And it's not just so you can get budget, right? You do need budget, but it's really so you get the time of the people where you're trying to do the automation, because you're only going to be as good as the information you get on the process you're automating. So I think making sure you get support of the businesses where you're moving into is going to drive a much quicker and a much more positive and efficient process. And then I mentioned around sort of quick wins, right? So find some quick early wins, so you get a sense for how it works. You can, develop a video of it so you can help educate folks, but that don't get caught up in, I'm going to do like 20 proofs of concept, because again, you're not proving the technology. It's been around for quite a long time. It's just to get more comfortable with it, but then, switch from there to, hey, where can I truly find opportunities for scale? And so, it's kind of shifting from that early, do a quick test to getting out to scale. And then, as I mentioned, obviously, all that supported by a strong COE is critical.
Right. Well, another question that we get confronted with all the time is, should you re-engineer the process before you automate the process with RPA? And I know I have an answer, but I suspect you have a particular take on this, having been
Yeah,
through
it's
this.
interesting because I even showed on my very first chart, like the re-engineering, way back when. And it's not like re-engineering is passe and shouldn't do that anymore, right? I mean, so my answer is, but it's a little bit different with this technology, right? So if you have a process that has, 20 steps in it, it's very, very inefficient, right? But and if you followed all the steps and you still got like a 10% error rate, well, automating is just going to make a faster erroneous process. Right? So that's not really helpful. So absolutely, then you need to re-engineer. But I think what's different about this type of technology is, given that, again, it's pretty low cost to implement. If you have a process that has those 20 steps, if you followed those 20 steps to the letter, even though it's very costly for people to do, but if you followed those exactly and you had 99% or 100% accuracy, then that actually is a good process to automate. Whereas with traditional automation, given how much it costs to automate that process, you would never do that. You would re-engineer first and then. So I would just say, if you have a inefficient process, but it's accurate if you follow it to the T, like the bot, doesn't matter if there's one step or 30 steps. So I would say you don't always have to re-engineer it. But if it's a broken process, right, then yeah, you need to change it before you automate.
Yeah. Yeah, my take on this, because often people treat these as separate things. I'm going to redesign the process, then I will think about automation. And I think if you are thinking about redesigning your process or re-engineering your process, and you're thinking about automating, do them at the same time, which means re-engineer or redesign with the idea of what can be automated, the capabilities of your technology in mind as you do it. If you ignore the technology, I think you really miss an opportunity to come up with new process designs that are really quite an improvement over the old process designs, right? And so that's one thing where I think people sort of underestimate the value of technology. Sometimes the fact that you can do a step that is very repetitive and today manual, but if I can turn that into an automated step, then it might change my whole thought about how the process gets designed.
Well, that is a great point, because typically you're not looking at RPA in a vacuum as just an RPA initiative, right? It's typically part of a broader transformation initiative. And you're right. I mean, you just keep in mind RPA is one of the many tools you could use to get there. And if you were going to re-engineer the process, you might actually be able to re-engineer it in a different way, knowing this technology exists, because it wouldn't have been possible before. Right. So I think you're absolutely right. It does change sort of the nature of re-engineering. The other interesting thing too, because again, it's quick to implement and low cost, is if because maybe you're implementing a new ERP or a major process redesign, that let's say in a year from now, you're going to totally change your processes. With traditional automation, you would never go ahead and implement automation now, right? You would say, well, let's wait until the process changes because it's all throwaway. With this type of automation, because you could implement in, say, 8 to 10 weeks and a relatively low cost, you might go ahead and, for some of those areas where it's just extremely painful and extremely costly to run now, you might say, I'm going to go ahead and implement RPA to automate those, knowing that in 1 to 2 years, when my ERP system's in place, I might have to throw away most of it. So that's another different dynamic. And we run into a lot of organizations say, hey, I'm about to implement SAP, Oracle, I'm just going to wait. And I'd say, yeah, for most of the processes, you probably should. But for a couple, I would go ahead and implement now, because you're going to get a lot of savings and reduce the pain for a lot of your employees in the meantime.
Right. Well, and those ERP implementations are not always on time. I've heard.
Yeah. Thanks, the safe statement.
Hey, one more point I wanted to get to. It's really, how do you differentiate your RPA solutions in the market? And I know you have probably an informed opinion given where you work, but how do you think about that, right? If you have RPA, why would you consider another provider? If you haven't bought yet, how do you choose, right? There's so much noise in the market.
Yeah, I mean, it is tough because because I think the technology is so successful and it's growing like gangbusters. There are hundreds of vendors out there, so I think there's a couple things to look for. I mean, one certainly I'd go with a leader in the marketplace. Secondly is I highlighted a couple of things, like having that integrated set of capabilities, so you don't have to use one vendor for attended automation, another one for unattended, another one for process discovery, another for document extraction. I mean, that just eases the implementation, because you said you need a suite of capabilities when you're going to transform a process. I think another is really ease of scaling, right? So initially you're just going to develop a couple of bots, but the goal hopefully is to expand it across an entire organization. And so ones that are very easy to code, you could see like my example of how low code it is, but they're not all made that way. In addition, the fact, like for example, ours is one of the few that's actually web and cloud based. So when you're going to scale, that's really critical in terms of being able to push that out, very quickly to organizations. So that's another thing. And then last thing I'd say is really having centralized enterprise-grade security and control. So we have a centralized control platform, for example, where you can see every single bot that's running across the organization, ensure which ones are running when, have centralized audit trails, et cetera. So ensuring you have that enterprise-grade control room is really critical, along with, as you'd expect, all kinds of dedicated support and training. So.
Right. No, I think that early, that move to the cloud and being web-based really has paid dividends, more so than I initially thought. When I first heard the announcement, it was hard for me to imagine how it would work. And I think it's really paid off.
Yeah, and we're really seeing, and it's not just in RPA, but everywhere. Ultimately everything's moving to the cloud, right? And we see a majority of our new implementations are all cloud-based, again, because it drives quick scale and obviously also provides all the, lower cost and all the data security, et cetera.
Right, absolutely. Well, any other questions from the audience? I think we hit them all. Yeah, I think we did. So, all right. Well, Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And it's good talking with you again. We could go on for another hour, but I think we'd have to order more bagels. It's look, it's always a pleasure sitting down with you and our friends from Automation Anywhere. Thank you for everyone who attended. I hope you enjoyed the webinar and got some useful information from myself and Ken. Be sure to be on the lookout tomorrow for the follow-up email with today's recording, in case you want to share that with colleagues or friends. And thanks again, and have a great day.
All right, great speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you.